Hello, folks, and welcome back to Leadership and Leaders Week on World War II TV. We've had some stonking shows so far this week. We missed Eisenhower because I had internet failure for 24 hours, but the show with Peter Caddick-Adams about Monty and Rommel was revealing, and people actually accepted that they kind of changed their views on those figures during that show, which is really quite cool. Ollie took us through the Russian command and Rokossovsky, and then yesterday, Dr. Phil Blood just knocked it out of the park with his talk about SS leadership and the Matrix. But today, we are talking about one of the most discussed leaders within Canada, and this is General Guy Simonds, and less discussed outside of Canada, but certainly within Canada, lots and lots of viewpoints on him. And my guest tonight, Major John Rickard, is in the middle of a book. Well, he's just finished it. It's in the peer review stage. A massive, great study of Simonds, the psychology behind the command, what the stresses and responsibilities are. So I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce him tonight. So good evening, John. Thank you very much for joining us.
Paul, thanks for the invitation. Great to be here.
So, I could list all your credits, but, professor of history, military, major, written books, you've done everything. So where did your interest in Simonds begin? Was it within the military? Was it as a teenager reading books about Normandy? Give me an idea about where it kind of started for you.
It started in the military. After I finished my PhD on Andy McNaughton, I wanted to continue on my study of command in detail and follow Guy Simonds, primarily because he was and is and continues to be very controversial for his command and leadership style. And I wanted to do a deep dive into it and find out exactly what the truth was. Follow a little bit of a different methodology than some historians, perhaps. I consciously had to unlearn everything I already knew about the historiography, being trained academically, professionally, and go back and look at the documents and build a skeleton, and then go back and then compare it to what historians have said. So it's led to some unique insights.
And maybe a crass question, but did your assessment of him change during the research process? Did you have the same conclusion about him at the end of the book as you did at the beginning of the book? Did it change during it? Where are you in your own kind of understanding of him?
No, it's changed over the years. My initial my gut impression and based on the opinions of historians when I was a young graduate student were a bit rigid and pretty much bought into the standard narrative of Guy as dictatorial, sort of brutish type commander. But I think if you're seriously engaged with material over a long period of time, your opinion should change. And mine did, and I think I've successfully taken some of the rough edges off of Guy without throwing everything out the window that's been written before.
Yeah, that's a good point. Peter Caddick-Adams made the very same point on Monday about writing about Rommel and Montgomery, that he went into it with a particular viewpoint and it changed several times during the process. And at the end of it, and now a few years on, his opinion is different about them now than it was even while the book was just being, in the bookshops. And that, David O'Keefe's talking about, that should be how we understand history and how we analyze it. And our ideas and conclusions should not be rigid and carved in stone. We should be able to re-examine and look at a new book and go, okay, there's a viewpoint there that I hadn't considered before. Take it on board and consider it. But we'll start with you. All my guests, you've given us a nice little PowerPoint presentation there. So I'll hand over to you to start talking, and then I will jump in with my inimitable style and with interruptions and questions from the audience. It seems most of Canada's historical contingent is watching this afternoon, so I expect we'll get for some questions. Mr. O'Keefe will probably jump in. Sam Cowan might jump in. So there we go. So I'll hand over to you, and I will jump in when I feel it's necessary.
Great, Paul. Thanks. That first slide says it all. In my opinion, he was a first-class soldier. He turned out to be the best soldier we produced, the best, highest commander we produced during the war, all around. That being said, of course, he had flaws like any commander. Was not perfect. His preparation for command was not perfect. But if you go to the next slide, I see nothing to argue with in Montgomery's overall assessment of Guy. Far and away, the best general we had, for sure, at the corps level. And even Dempsey would tell Ronald Lewin after the war that Guy was the best of his corps commanders. And that's in a mix with O'Connor and Crocker and Ritchie and even the legendary Brian Horrocks. So it's that's high praise indeed. And I think it's warranted at the end of the day. When you add everything up, you assess all the factors and all the things that he had to do and accomplish and the pressures and strains that he's under, I think he deserves that title. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that it was a pretty fast ascent for Guy. And this slide, I think, speaks to the fundamental difference in the Canadian experience between World War I and World War II. We're in the war very quickly in World War I, and we stay there, and we're gaining combat experience steadily. People have time to learn. The unique circumstances of World War II meant that we didn't have a lot of opportunities or accept a lot of opportunities to get our commanders combat experience. And you can see Guy's only combat experience comes at that critical stage in Sicily when he commands first div for 5 months. His greatest weakness, according to Montgomery's own criteria for developing corps commanders, was that lack of commanding an armored division. He's there for a little bit, but it's all administrative knowledge. So he never gets a chance to really test any ideas, especially his pre-war ideas about how one should actually use armor. Okay. If you go to the next slide.
And what were his pre-war ideas? I mean, does he come from the kind of Guderian way? Does he think about warfare? Do we know if he's read people like Rommel and Guderian? And what do you think as a young man growing up, his kind of interest was? I mean, he clearly kind of had aspirations of being in the military from quite a young age. Is that right?
No question. There's a military legacy there for his family. He is a true professional soldier, but he is also a student of war. They're not necessarily the same thing, although they can cross paths. I think the most important thing is his willingness to accept new ideas and his flexibility. He once said about the Camberley Staff College that it's not the place where one should learn what to think, but learn how to think, right? And you can see, and he says that back in the 30s. You can see that link between that philosophy and his use of the planning tools that he was taught, especially the appreciation and how that actually manifests in Normandy. Everyone respected his ability to process a problem, to analyze a problem with clarity and with speed. That's the key. That's the difference between military men and academics. Academics have 4 years to write their thesis. Military men have to evaluate a situation and make a decision, or select a course of action quickly, under pressure, usually under fire.
That is a very pertinent point there, because me and my best mate Colin in Normandy, who's maybe watching tonight, we sometimes sit in my living room drinking single malts, considering what could have been done on Omaha or Verrières Ridge or wherever it would be. And we realize as right. Tour guides in Normandy, we have something like a 40-year experience between us. With studying Normandy, we have something like a 70-year experience between us. And of course, there are a couple of things we would do differently with all that hindsight and 2020 vision. But the point is, at the time, with things flying, bullets literally flying, aircraft flying over, artillery exploding, it's very difficult to make those decisions. I think it's always it's a kind of a point to make, that it's easy to be the armchair general, less easy to be there doing it in the first time. But I'll hand back to you and I'll move on to your next slide.
Sure. So these are the basic criticisms of Simonds, and of course there are others, but these are the fundamental ones that I latched onto, that I explore detail in the study. And they're fairly serious charges, but when you really study Simonds and study the documents and study the context of what he's dealing with in terms of personalities, the missions he's assigned, the time pressure, the time and space constraints, I think your views will be modified a little bit. And this one, the second bullet there, the failure to properly train subordinates, that's a fairly serious charge. And if you go to the next slide, we'll introduce the key subordinates here. In the top three of the Canadian division commanders he has in Normandy: Charles Folks, 2nd Division; Rod Keller, 3rd Division; and George Kitching of the 4th Division. The individuals at the bottom, Mockich, Polish Armored Commander; Tom Rennie from 51st Highland Division; Bobby Erskine, 7th Armored Desert Rats; and Alan Adair of the Guards Armored. They will be attached and detached at different times in Normandy. But the Canadians are the main focus here. And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the training that Simonds gives these individuals when he comes back, when he takes over command of the Corps in January 44. It seems like he has a long time to prepare the Corps for combat, but he really doesn't. Not when you consider when he shows up, all the command and staff changes that go on, all the limitations of loading and when to load, all the artificialities and problems of finding of training in England and finding large training areas to use at that point. It's a difficult problem set. The guy in the middle, Rod Keller, Guy has no influence over, because he's under command of Crocker's First Corps for the invasion of the continent. Nor does Simonds have any influence over 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, Bob Wyman's brigade. So he can't really influence that. Charles Folks is considered a political general, has no combat experience at all, but is a favorite and is protected somewhat by Harry Currar. And Guy steps a bit gingerly around Harry because of serious confrontation the two of them had in Italy just a couple months before he took over the Corps. George Kitching is not probably not the optimal individual to command the 4th Canadian Armored Division. He's an infantry, has no armored background at all. And Simonds originally wanted him to be his chief of staff, but Kerr intervened and killed that idea. So Guy had to find another chief of staff, who ends up to be Elliot Rodger. But you can imagine the difficulty in England when Simonds issues his operational policy and his comments on leadership about how to actually practice it all. He has to observe all these individuals on exercise, the way Monty did earlier in the war, and try to find out what their strengths and weaknesses are for real in an artificial environment, like training in the UK late in the war. Guy fundamentally believes at the end of the day that no training, however, is an actual replacement for actual battle experience. and as logical as that is, the crucible, the learning curve in actual combat is, especially in Normandy, is absolutely brutal. And he's distracted in many ways while he's trying to train in England, trying to train for set-piece battles to break main lines of resistance, while he's also told to prepare to cross estuaries and break out of a bridgehead and push 40 miles to the east. That's Operation Axehead, and that comes down as a directive for him to train, superimposed on top of his core training program. So it's not optimal in any case. And that after 4 years of war, none of the 3 Canadians that go ashore in Normandy have any combat experience. They're learning as they go, not at the division level. Kitching, of course, has some combat experience in Italy at brigade level, and he never has any opportunity to actually practice to move around and grasp the big muscle movements of an armored division on exercise in the UK. So context is everything. Guy he knows fundamentally, he knows very well that he has no primus, he has no go-to number 1 division commander. He doesn't have a Tucker. He doesn't have a true student of war at any of those positions. And it will show. So his task is to coach and mentor these individuals basically in the crucible of combat as he's trying to meet the higher intent of Dempsey and Kerr and ultimately Montgomery. He's trying to wage an army group battle. So if we go to the next slide.
Do we know anything about how he addressed that kind of on a personal level, going in to try and set up command of some of these individuals? Because there's been some comments in the sidebar about Maciek and the Poles particularly. And where's the comment? I thought was it. There we are. Maciek created an armored brigade while Simonds was a junior officer, which is a valid point, and I would be yes. Jenny Grant, who did my show about Maciek a few weeks ago. Jenny is the massive Silence in Polish is her Twitter handle, and she's always every day talking about the Polish. And she made a point, I forget whether it's Krerar's book or something Simonds wrote, but she was saying that just 2 or 3 days ago that when Maciek came up in one of these books, they got his first name wrong. They called him Stefan when his name is Stanislaw. So this kind of idea that he's maybe not really given the respect, because Maciek has been there and done it and done some extraordinary things. So I completely take your point that Fulks and Kitching haven't perhaps got that experience, but there is a guy there under his command who has been and done stuff. I would at some point in tonight's show like you to address the relationship he has with the Poles, because I just think we've got quite a few people who like that aspect. Polish Armored Division are quite a World War II TV favorite, really. So at some point, if you could elaborate on that, that'd be really cool.
Sure. Okay, next slide.
Yeah.
Right. So the complaint that Simonds doesn't care about leadership and only seeks to command and is sort of robotic in that sense and doesn't care about the psychology of the situation is just, ultimately it's just flat wrong. He's always paid attention to the situation. He's an understudy of Montgomery. Montgomery stressed the human element in everything. Guy's just not as overtly expressive of the idea as Monty was. He doesn't stand on the top of jeeps. Guy is not Henry V. You're not going to get a St. Christmas Day speech from Guy. Fundamentally, he believed that he would lead the Corps by the sheer professionalism of his approach. And that should wear off on his subordinates. Now, when I say that doesn't mean that he's oblivious to the idea of coaching and mentoring. Because if you think that would be a false assumption, I believe, based on all the evidence. He does his due diligence in trying to coach and mentor, and he does it initially by issuing documents in his operational policy and his ideas on leadership, as you can see here. Right. What you don't see there is something called charisma. So someone like Patton would say, where the hell's your bullet on charisma, right? And your personality. Guy doesn't stress that a whole lot. Professional competence to him is probably more important than bravado or swagger. He is seriously attuned to the idea that the lack of professionalism will cost lives, and I think he's probably bang on in that ultimately. Because if you have charisma and you have bravado, you absolutely have to have the professionalism that goes along with it. If you're going to have one, if you can only pick one, I think you should probably pick professionalism, because that's the glue that holds everything together. The idea of initiative and judgment and knowledge, those are very, very important, because they're all linked to that one on the left-hand side under moral self-confidence. And you can imagine these guys, these division commanders, you can imagine their level of self-confidence. Whether they really felt ready is difficult to establish. That no one actually says, geez, we didn't feel ready to go. Folks, for example, actually said that he thought the state of training was as great as he could ever hope to be, and he was taking a first-class fighting machine into Normandy. So you can imagine the psychological trap that our guys faced going in there, expressing confidence, but probably knowing this is going to be a tough one. And Simonds has to deal with all this too on an individual basis. So as I said before, Folks has no combat experience. Keller will, but when Simonds takes over, stands up the Corps, and it goes operational on 11 July, Keller's close to being worn out, and he's been called out by Crocker and Dempsey and Montgomery for being substandard as a division commander. So guys got one guy with no combat experience, another that's pretty much getting worn out, and his armored division commander who's never commanded an armored division before, and will be expected to go the tip of the spear and spearhead a Corps operation a few days after landing. So it's a tough psychological position that he's in as a commander, and all his subordinates obviously too. And one thing I'll say, this command pressure in Normandy will be phenomenal, right? And command pressure only goes one way. It goes down. Superiors feel the pressure of lives being lost at the bottom, but command pressure doesn't go up. It's always down. And it's heaviest on those guys at the tip of the spear who have to execute the plans. Yeah. Okay, next slide. Guy's very clear in his expectations for these guys, for the division commanders, and all the formation commanders. He does not want them to repeat orders in parrot fashion. And Guy's been criticized for basically giving his division commanders no leeway. But in modern terms, we would say that they're supposed to take his orders and do their own mission analysis and figure out how they should optimize their resources to achieve his higher intent, which is key. Quick to grasp, and everything he says here makes perfect sense. The problem is these guys don't have enough experience, Folks and Kitching, right? To even understand where things are going pear-shaped, right? And they'll only get it as time goes on. Next slide. So he's been heavily criticized for basically killing initiative in his subordinates and dictating everything, concept of operations, the ski maneuver, the fire plans, the air support plans. But this is what he actually says. It's essential that these guys demonstrate initiative, but initiative in the confines of his higher intent. And that's key. We recognize that today. I think there's a tendency to want the Canadians to be a bit more like the Germans and practice Ausstreich tactique and create some chaos and see what happens. You have to understand that's not in line with his mind. It's not in line with the way Dempsey thought, and it's not in line with the way Monty envisioned the operation unfolding, with the Great Shield in the east and the final breakout as the main effort in the west. All right. So the operational plan at the highest levels dictates to a certain extent how you're actually going to fight. But at no point does he ever try to cramp their initiative. And he doesn't try to cramp their initiative, but at the end of the day, he is attuned to the idea that he has to intervene and correct mistakes if his intent is not being met. And that's key. So generally, when he does show up and take charge of a situation or issue a new directive, it's portrayed as Simonds's managerial top-down sort of Canadian business approach, but it's all perfectly understandable. It's his concept of operation. It's his intent. He's ultimately responsible, and he's taking the steps he needs to drive it home. Sometimes that gets lost. Next slide. Okay, so the hard part is to actually play his role inside Montgomery's Army Group battle. And it's no easy task at all, because when he takes over and stands up the Corps, we're facing the bulk of the Panzer divisions. And we'll end up fighting virtually everybody. The Liebstandarte and elements of Das Reich and Hohenstaufen and Frundsberg and Hitler Youth and 272nd Division and 85th Division, 89th Division, 16th Luftwaffe Division, the Tiger Battalions, most of the Flak Corps. So it's there's nothing easy about any of the problem sets that he faces in Normandy. And because they're not easy for him, they're not easy for subordinates. You can see there the ones in yellow are the Canadian operations, Windsor and Charnwood, before the Corps becomes operational. Then those four big operations, Atlantic, which is the Canadian component of Goodwood, Spring, Totalize, and Tractable. And Spring obviously is connected with Cobra as Monty desperately tries to harmonize these big muscle movements on the east and west flanks to achieve a unified effect, which is to disrupt the Germans, paralyze them, right? So they're not really sure what foot to be on, and then smash home the final blow in the west with the American First Army. The holding attack idea on the eastern flank, it can only be described as brutal. It's a brutal task, a mission to receive, because the psychology is so positive psychology is very elusive. You have to hammer away simultaneously trying to attract the Germans as you're trying to gain ground in the very spot where they're amassing the greatest amount of combat power. So it's a difficult problem set, and but Guy is he's incredibly mentally tough. He is the right guy, and I don't know if Monty puts him there on purpose because of that reason, but I think of all the Corps commanders, he's probably the one best mentally suited for that task of ultimately breaking through the main lines of resistance of 1st SS Panzer Corps.
I just want to jump in here because a couple of things you say there, I want to address. First is that list of operations. I want to make sure that our viewers don't believe that they were all kind of planned in advance of D. That's the sequence as we know it is after they've unfolded, but it's a constantly evolving situation as the attritional phase post D-Day kind of sets in, and Epsom sort of doesn't get off to a great start. And so, yeah, I want people to be aware that these are gradually set up as the situation changes. The second thing is, I think it's been very interesting that, because we talked before we went online earlier about historiography and looking back at things, it seems to me that only really comparatively recently have people been able to articulate really what that whole eastern flank job was around kind of holding off the Germans. I mean, James Holland, for example, talked in his documentary last year or the year before about the Germans blunting themselves against that sort of blockade around Caen, whereas the conventional historiography of people like Max Hastings back in the 80s was that the British and the Canadians weren't advancing and that we weren't very good and the Germans were counterattacking and crushing us. But actually, every day that passed throughout June and July and even into August, the Germans are smashing themselves to bits against our rock, so that when we finally do move, we have, as you just said there, bested the best part of 7 or 8 armor divisions and area there. But if it's taken us 70 plus years to about to explain it in that level now, going back to 1944, because you're very articulate, you're very eloquent, if you had been around in 1944 as Simonds PR guy, I think we'd have had a different view of what it was. He and his staff able to communicate this as well back at the time to both his commanders and both to the men? Because as you say, command pressure goes down. What was it? Was the picture as clear back then in 1944? I think is my question.
I think it's pretty clear for Atlantic. His intent is very clear for Atlantic. They fundamentally have to establish bridges across the Orne. And the textbook Staff College answer is it takes 72 hours to get a corps across a river. And it took 72 hours to get 2 Canadian corps across the river. And he did it, and he got 7+ brigades across on schedule. We can talk about the first assault on Verrières Ridge on the 20th, if you want to.
People of that came up in the sidebar earlier on about a couple of people said that whatever they learn from you tonight about Simonds, they will have in their head, from their point of view, the mismanagement of the Verrières Ridge Operation Spring thing, and that is, I suppose, the stick people use to beat Simonds with. So run through for the viewers kind of what the plan was and what the conventional criticism of Simonds is and what your evaluation of that is, if you wouldn't mind.
Right. The attack on the 20th of July has been characterized as ill-advised and unnecessary. But as far as I'm concerned, everyone of importance knew that Simonds was going to go for Verrières Ridge. He was instructed in order to go for Verrières Ridge on the 20th for its tactical and operational significance.
Yeah.
Right. The 18th and 19th of July had been very, very successful. They had come down south of the river, established a fairly decent line, but the best tactical ground was Verrières Ridge. All right. Dempsey knows full well that he's going to make the assault, and he makes the assault. He makes the assault with 2 division. Folks' first real opportunity to actually execute Guy's operational policy as stated from February 44. On a 1 brigade front, which is textbook Guy Simonds, who says that basically it takes all the divisional artillery to support 1 brigade in the assault. And that's the technique. And they try, and the brigadier, Hugh Young, it's his first battle. And you can tell by the way how poorly it was designed that that Guy was not micromanaging and overly controlling folks in the design of that operation. Okay, because it violated a whole bunch of things Guy already knew were wrong. But he's allowing these guys a lot of leeway up front to get their legs under them. And of course, the assault turns out to be a failure, and 4 Canadian battalions are hit in sequence by German panzers and battle groups, essentially infantry, tank heavy units, in sequence over several hours. And the logs are very, very revealing about how poorly the operation was planned and how bad the use of reserves were and how slow they were to respond to the crisis. And 6th Brigade gets swept right off the ridge. And that's the end of Operation Atlantic. I can't go into all the detail, but there's a lot of issues there with 8 Corps in what O'Connor is supposed to do, what 7th Armored Division is supposed to do. There are boundary issues. There are bomb line issues. Suffice it to say, it was a brutal introduction for infantry brigadier about how quickly the Germans would counterattack, right?
Mm.
And how bad our doctrine was in certain respects. The anti-tank doctrine says you should get the anti-tank guns up on the position once the infantry consolidate within 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes for exposed infantry, knowing how quickly the Germans counterattack was just a recipe for disaster, and that's what happened.
Yeah. But I can see I absolutely see your point about the fact that you clarified that he hadn't had that combat experience until Sicily, and it's still not terribly much. And he's taken over commanders that haven't had huge amount of experience. He's got a plan, but at the same time, he doesn't want to be completely controlling, as you say. Give them some leeway. It's a very, very tight balancing act to go into Atlantic and Spring. And Montgomery's got more experience. I know Montgomery's at a higher level. It's not fair to compare Montgomery and Simonds in that respect. And Montgomery had the First World War to look back on and experience there as well. But it is interesting to kind of try and face it from Simonds' point of view about how much do I impress on this of my own views and how much do I allow my junior commanders to do their bit. It's a tight. And by the way, the conversation about Ultra came up in the sidebar as well, from David O'Keefe, as you would imagine, about the Ultra, suggesting that Spring should have proceeded. I like the fact you mentioned 7th Armored Division, their British division, because that, I think, we British examine the 7th Armored Division in the same way I think you have in Canada analyze Operation Spring and Verrières Ridge. I think that there's been a lot of study of 7th Armored from Villers-Bocage onwards, I think, and changing of commanders, things like that. And O'Connor has an interesting history that he'd be an interesting person to discuss. He came up in Peter Caddick Adams' discussion about Montgomery, about how he could say things because he gradually kind of just drifts away, just loses response, just moves away, and can say things because he's no longer in command. But we're going down a potential rabbit hole, which David O'Keefe now knows is the drinking signal. But it was important to discuss Operation Spring. It is, as Sam Cowan said, it is the stick people use to beat Simonds with. And from my British point of view as a tour guide, and I'll let you carry on and we go towards Totalize and Tractable later. When I'm talking about Guy Simonds on the ground, I think whatever criticism you can level at him for Verrières Ridge, he does seem to act quite quickly to address those. I'm sure you're going to expand on that in a minute. He doesn't. So we all make mistakes. It's how you bounce back from them.
Sure. Next slide.
Yeah.
So just quickly to let you know, like commanding a corps is no small thing. You could have 2 divisions one day and 6 the next. And this is what he has for Totalize, and we'll talk about Totalize in a little bit. But the white divisional boxes there are obviously the Canadian units, and he requests and receives those other units there, 51st Highland, the Poles, and the 33rd Armored Brigade. It's a massive organization that he has. It's a small army that he has for the final penetration of the main line of resistance. No easy task. And span of control issues, you can talk about that. No textbook, no more than 5. But I see no evidence that he was incapable of, expanding his span of control. I just want to cycle back. The discussion I just talked about, I just had about 6th Brigade. That's for the first assault on Verrières on the 20th. That's at the end of Goodwood. As I said, because there are serious geometry issues with 3rd and 2nd Division and between the 2 corps. But we'll move on to Spring in this next slide, I think. No, we'll come to it in a few seconds. This is what I want to emphasize when I talk about psychology. Guy is very specific in stating his expectations. And it gets overlooked. People quote it all the time, and it ends up in footnotes and whatever, but no one really pays any attention to it. He tells them exactly what he expects of them, all right? I'm going to make heavy demands on you at times when you're probably at your worst, because that's what the situation is going to demand. Now, if you're a subordinate, you have to internalize that, and now you have to pass that down to your subordinates. So everybody understands what's required. Okay? So it's an example of how he does not ignore psychology. In fact, he's got his finger on the pulse of the Corps and his division commanders and the temper and the mood and the damage they're taking. So he's not oblivious to any of this. Okay, next slide. This is what he knows about himself. Okay, and this is true. There's no reason to dispute any of this. Okay, and this is part of the reason why he's characterized as sometimes brutish and overbearing, because he could be. There's no doubt, but he could also be considerate. He could be kind. He could mentor and coach in the best sense of the two words. But pay attention to that bottom quote there. He's impatient of stupidity, dullness, and indifference. And if you're any of those things, you're going to feel the Simonds wrath. Because he
I think
thinks
it's a good
that
time to mention that David O'Keefe made a good comment there. No, this one. No, where we are? Sorry. If he's clear about what he expects of people, is that going down the chain of command? Are people aware of what he expects of them? Are they really grasping that? It's all very well him being clear with it. And I don't know whether David's right or wrong. I'm just interested, and I'll let you two Canadians thrash this one out. David is being typically David O'Keefe and about this, but the communication, because you made that connection about how he does care about his men, he does want them to understand what's expected of them, and I think that's something when we talked about Monty on Monday, and I think about, for example, the British 6th Airborne Division on the Breville Ridge for 3 months, and they were sitting there basically not moving for 3 months, being shelled and losing men every day. I always feel that no one ever came and told them what they were doing there. They were just sitting there, and I can understand if you're in the 7th Parachute Battalion or whatever it is, 12th Yorkshire, you can understand you're losing a couple of guys in an attack if you've taken out a village, if you've moved forward, you've gained some ground. But if you're just sitting in the same place and no one's asking you to go anywhere and you're losing people every day and no one's explaining what you're doing, morale just crashes. So I think in that sense, Montgomery can't communicate to people below him what is expected of him. So Guy, you're claiming that Guy has these clear objectives, but are they filtering down? Are people under him getting that message? What's your gut feeling?
Yeah, there's evidence that it is filtering down. So I have no problem stating that. The war diaries, the logs, the first-person accounts all capture the flavor of that, if not ubiquitous across all units at all times. Okay? It can be spotty here and there, but that's all based on the personality and the what is the number one priority of the subordinate commander at any one point in time. But Guy consistently expresses his expectations from February 44, 16 July, 30 July, 13 August, including all the unrecorded conversations he would have with the division commanders and the brigadiers when he got a chance to get them all together and speak to them when he went forward. Because that's part of his command technique, to go forward regularly to see the division commanders. He thought and planned 2 levels down. So he went forward to see the brigadiers when he could. But you can imagine how many brigadiers he has, so you can't go see them all the time. Mm-hmm. Hence, concept of main effort psychologically. Where's my main effort? So he understands that. But Dave's correct that it's not going to filter at the same rate across all units.
I mean, there's definitely conversations going on. Dadust, who's Polish, is saying that clear from his point of view. I think Jenny, if she was on, she's going to watch the show tomorrow. She's busy tonight. She would definitely make the claim that the Poles definitely don't understand what is expected of them in Totalize and Tractable, and that it's not language. It's some more basic level of communication. I know it's a potential rabbit hole to just talk about the Poles, and there's lots of other things to talk about, but it isn't clear getting through to everybody on the same level. But maybe that's because the Poles are kind of a separate animal in this situation, and perhaps they're not representative of the core at a greater level. But I just thought I'd mention it.
No, I think the Poles realize what's expected of them at about 1,700 hours on the 8th of August, because their entire first line is gone. Okay, they had crossed the line of departure in phase 2, and hadn't gone more than a couple hundred yards when they're hit by counterattack by fire from all directions, and they get punched in the mouth. And that experience, that bad experience lingers throughout the day, causes some issues on the next day. But within a few days, the Poles do recover psychologically, and they will become the actual true maneuver arm that Simonds needs in this later stage of the campaign. And Simonds will go to Mach-Each instead of Kitching for this final maneuver to get down and try to close the gap. He selects him first. Okay. When in fact Kitching's closer and in better position.
Which tells you something. Yeah, so, that's interesting.
Absolutely. So I don't want to overturn some of the completely overturn some of the negative perspectives of Guy, because he knows very well what his own flaws are, right? Which is a great trait to have as a commander. But you can see there he's trying. He knows he has to try to restrain his temper, because it can be perceived as interpreted as generating fear, right? But he's not really. This commanders, the subordinates aren't really afraid of Simonds. They have a healthy respect for Simonds. Okay, he's there to try to help them solve their problems, just like the division commander's there to help the brigadiers solve their problems, and so on down the chain. Next slide. And of course, he's not all, fear and brusqueness. He can actually sometimes show some emotion. Here's the famous Simonds smile. I thought I'd just throw that up there for quick distraction.
Well, it's worth pointing out, because it's come up this week about likability. Is likability necessary to be a good leader? Do you need to be respected? Is one thing, liked is a different thing. How much of yourself do you show to your men, and what's your style is? And it came up in a couple of the shows. Is when you, at whatever level of command, if at the beginning of your career you set your stall out in a certain way, you're going to be a shouter, you're going to be an arm around the shoulder person, you're going to be a thoroughly explaining person. It's difficult to kind of change your style halfway through your career. You've kind of got to stick with something and that be your style. Is he trying to kind of be an everyman in some ways? He's trying to kind of balance all the aspects. I kind of see a bit of that in him, and that he's kind of wants to get a 7 out of 10 on everything.
He's trying. Harry Foster, who will take over the division from Kitching, says, "I give Simonds credit. He does try, right? He does try for that human touch and to make some sort of stronger connection with the individuals. He's just not very good at it. He's just not very good at it. That's why he fundamentally relies on his professionalism generating sufficient respect that people will loyally execute his orders. Charisma is great.
I mean, Sam has just mentioned the fact that he's got a temper. So, that was one of the. You said that earlier. He addresses that he's quick-tempered, and that is something that is used as another stick to beat him with. But if he's addressing it himself and he knows that's not a failing, it's a character trait, then maybe we can discount it, because it's if he knows that's a problem of his. I don't know. It's I'm going down a potential psychological rabbit hole now, but
no, yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point. Losing your temper for no effect is really pointless. But if you're losing your temper out of frustration because something's not happening that should happen, that for a conscious that's a little bit more excusable, right? Alan Adair was famous for saying, you're going to get. It's better to use honey, right? But sometimes subordinates need a good rocket. And even Rommel would say that sometimes you have to shake subordinates right out of their apathy by a good rocket, because apathy will set in. The ways of doing things will set in. Attitudes will set in, and guys trying to keep the core on track. And unfortunately, it's he's got a little bit of Schwarzkopf in him, but you have to judge that against the outcome and what we actually achieved.
Yeah, I mean, Britain, we call that outburst the hairdryer effect after Alex Ferguson, manager of Manchester United back in the 90s. That it's not so much the fact you blow off steam, it's how you react to it afterwards. It's how you then move on. And you go, okay, we've done that bit. Now let's move forward. If everyone starts sulking, and it just you don't get anywhere. So it's part of a process, isn't it? It's that thing that's come up with our discussions is if you isolate some of these commanders and talk about the moments they sent angry letters or they had outbursts without the context of what happened before and after that, it's worthless. It's how do you follow up that? How do you get it? You've had your outburst, you've thrown your teddy out of the pram and saying England, and then right, next stage, let's get our heads together and do this. So I'm understanding from my, with your 1,000-page book coming out, that so many of the books I've read where Simonds comes up, there has been an idea the authors had about Simonds that he's kind of pushing through that narrative, and they don't want to sway from that. But yeah, I'll let you continue.
Well, at the end of the day, the commanders, you have a choice as a commander. You can tell everybody what you want to do, and then you can back off and not supervise, or you can make sure that your intent is being executed. And if your intent's not being executed, there are consequences. And then the art of command is when you intervene, how you intervene, to what extent. Do you relieve people? Do you pull the chief, the GSO one aside and have a talk to the chief of staff? I mean, there are multiple options, but at the end of the day, it's an outcome-based business.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
the bottom line. Right. So just a quick note on planning style. Guys also criticized for his top-down planning method. He would be eviscerated at Staff College today, where we sort of plan collaboratively and then brief the boss on a whole bunch of different codes. And he says, I'll take some of this code and some of that code and put it all together. That wasn't the Simonds method or the Monty method. He was the brain. He came up with the concept of operations after smoking several cigarettes, probably in his caravan. Had it clear enough in his head that he was confident of the concept. And then he would engage in staff collaboration, and they would come together. So Elliot Rogers there on the screen, that's his chief of staff. And no truer words were said than the bottom part there, when Simonds briefed the O group about what they were going to do for Totalize. Okay. Simonds is the brain. Here's the concept. Okay, staff, now go to work and tell me how this is going to happen. Do the staff checks, make it so. But he's completely open to all the different nuances of what's the art of the possible once the staff planning begins. That point often gets overlooked. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is probably one of the most important slides because now we're at the 25th of July and we're talking about spring. Spring is a brutal operation. It's misinterpreted in many ways, but at the end of the day, it's just one in the series of holding attacks on the eastern flank toward Operation Cobra. Bottom line. And Guy, without heavy bomber support, has to entice the Germans into believing it's a main attack and get them to commit their corps level reserve, which in this case is 9th SS Panzer Division, the Hohenstaufen. You can see the importance, the difficulty and the difference in spring compared to other operations because he doesn't have heavy bomber support, so he has to entice the Germans to believe it's a main attack by other means. And part of the other means is a wider frontage. Okay? And it goes from Saint Andre all the way over to Tilly, and 2 divisions are involved with 2 main phases, 2 infantry phases, securing villages, with the 3rd phase being exploitation, if possible. This is why he describes the operation as being planned, legislated for or against success. Okay, he has to be flexible because, as Dave O'Keefe will point out, the intelligence generally is telling him how much combat power is over the hill. But that's precisely the point, right? This is part of the whole strain that he's under. You have to launch an attack knowing very well you're cut right into the teeth of the German defense in hopes that they stay even more in against you. And Monty is ultimately happy with the operation despite the casualties. So if you're a number 1 rifleman in a section in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, it's a bad show. There's no doubt absolutely at all about that at all. But at the operational level, Monty's level, it's successful. And you can never perfectly reconcile those 2 levels. It's not possible because the perspectives are different, right?
Very good point.
That's part of the strain. And he knows how important it is, and he knows that this is what he has to do. I mean, he's following orders. He's got to fight where he's told to fight, when he's told to fight, and for how long, right?
I think that's your Philip Blood's moment last night was talking about Warsaw. Your moment just there about clarifying that the Operation Spring is actually part of Operation Cobra is my kind of moment. It is. I hadn't really kind of connected the dots in that way before because there's so much Canadian writing about Verrières Ridge is in isolation, and I think that's a general failing with looking at Normandy. Is a book about Goodwood needs to cover the other operations before and afterwards. A book about Totalize Tractable, it's the whole sequence that I think makes sense. If you take any one of them in isolation, you can make of it what you want. It's trying to get that overview that is so hard in terms of military history, I think.
No question. In Spring, it doesn't matter to Monty whether Spring goes before or after Cobra, because the effect is generally the same. Right? You have to hold as much combat power as you can opposite the Canadians to give Bradley and Lightning Joe Collins an opportunity to really gain some traction and turn the corner on the Germans.
Yeah.
Right? And think about this is 5 July break out. According to the initial joint plan, they still are supposed to go down into Brittany and clear Brittany.
Yeah.
And Omar Bradley's perfectly in sync. He understands exactly what Monty is supposed to do. Dempsey is supposed. Dempsey's own operations order for the invasion says there will be no major operations to break out anywhere in any direction until the Brittany ports are cleared. Okay, that's a massive strain on the eastern edge of the bridgehead, and we're right in the epicenter of it. So it's a source of frustration, but it's a source of actual significant pride because you're taking on the best, and we like to think they sent in the best. So it's some things you just can't resolve. They just are, and that was our time and place, and it was our job. Next slide. Right, so we'll skip ahead to Totalize, and anybody can ask questions about it at any point. Obviously, we're talking about command and leadership technique, and suffice it to say, Guy is not happy with George Kitching and the way he's actually gripped the division from the first day of Totalize, when he only gains a few hundred yards down the Conflades Highway in Phase 2. Knowing full well there's all kinds of issues, legitimate issues with the long pause between the two bombings, which didn't help Kitching a whole lot. That being said, he's not very effective as a division commander on any of those days in Totalize. Completely loses track of Worthington Force on the 9th. Loses a absolutely golden opportunity to do what the Germans are credited with doing, is exploiting chaos. They had actually punched through the main line of resistance established by 12th SS Panzer Division, and had an opportunity to break the whole front open, but Kitching lost the battle group and couldn't find it to reinforce it. He has a lack of grip throughout the rest of the operation, and I is particularly frustrated with the inability of the Armored Corps, the regiments, and the Brigadier, and even Kitching, to follow his orders and continue operations at night. Now, I'm an armored officer, so I know full well about the whole requirement for maintenance and when that is supposed to occur. But that is, in Simonds' mind, that was textbook. That's what the textbook said. He's trying to maintain against a very elusive foe that knows the ground intimately, and he's looking for opportunity to maintain momentum and tempo, which was Courreur's criticism of the entire operation to begin with. He's like, "Guy, you got to tell me how you're going to maintain momentum and tempo once we launch Totalize." So on the 13th of August, Kitching gets the armored commanders together and tears a strip off of them, and gives them a socket. As you can see there, that's what Kitching says, and basically tells them they have to be more aggressive and forget about harboring and leaguering at night, and to press on and change the way they're using their echelon system and keep going, because too much time is being lost. And of course, Monty has set the watch, right, for the final meeting up with the Americans at coming up for Argentan, which is a whole different story, but we don't have time to talk about that, unfortunately. And it's a difficult moment. There's no question. All the evidence suggests that Simonds had really stuck a knife in them, and Kitching told Guy and complained that he was pretty rough on them, and Guy's response was essentially, "Well, I had to, George. You weren't doing anything." Okay, so you get the sense over the week of Totalize that Guy is letting things go, and he's frustrated, but he's trying to let Kitching sort it out, and Kitching can't sort it out. And this will lead ultimately to the next slide, where Kitching relieves his best friend. Simonds relieves his best friend, George Kitching, on the 21st, basically just hours before the gap is finally sealed by the Poles and the Americans coming up from the south. But Simonds had just had enough, and after only a few weeks in actual operations, he pulls the trigger on his best friend Kitching and replaces him with Harry Foster, who's actually an armored officer of Strathcona, which is my regiment. Nice plug there for the regiment. But it's characterized as Kitching is a victim of Guy's ruthlessness, right? Or here's another example of Guy Simonds just cutting heads off because that's the Guy Simonds that cut and slash, zero tolerance, no patience. Well, you're the Corps commander responsible for lives, and you see evidence building day by day that Kitching can't grip the division. You know, at the end of the day, I conclude that it was justified, and Foster takes over the division, does a good job. And there's all kinds of reasons that Kitching offers, and some of them are valid. You know, his fatigue and sleep deprivation, and the casualties amongst the commanders. He goes through 3 brigadiers in a few days. But at the end of the day, you get a sense that Kitching does more explaining than gripping. and Simonds just finally has enough. Talk about the Poles for a little bit. No question there was tension at first. No question. Legitimate concerns about whether Machich was up to the job. But that dissipates pretty quick. And I think Guy becomes genuinely impressed with Machich's ability to get the division moving, right? To sweep around and take up position on the left flank, to cross the rivers, to punch through the German scattered defenses, splitting German defenses, operating in some brutal ground in the hills, deal with friendly fire from Kitching. They're shooting each other because they're side by side, being bombed by their own aircraft, right? Polish units going astray for whatever reason, French guides, whatever explanation you want to use. The fact is they go astray, but they recover and rally, and they get down and take a hell of a beating down there on the Mace, but ultimately, play their role. And I think Guy ultimately was happy to have them. But imagine
I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, when Jenny did her show about the Poles, well, about the general particularly, because her explanation for the kind of the roaming free elements of the Polish division was kind of the regional differences within that Polish armor division, within the regiments. There were sort of some different traditional kind of things, cultural things, and the commanders of those regiments kind of were allowed to do their own thing. To me, and I don't really have a dog in the Guy Simonds fight. I don't really come down one side or the other, but I think his management of the Polish armor division was really exemplary. I think I always refer to the Poles as the Jeb Stuart of the Normandy campaign, that they just allow them that almost free role, which I think they did exceptionally well, despite, as you say, some hiccups, despite some things that didn't go perfectly. I think if he had tried to bring them more under his command, it would have been taking away their flexibility, because they are, as armor divisions go, they are self-sufficient in a way that others aren't.
Yeah, the armored echelon is a bit different than the infantry echelon, for sure. They do seriously test their logistics to the point where they have to be reinforced by airdrops, which is more or less effective. Thank God it didn't go on much longer than that, because the elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had turned around and come back and hit them from multiple directions. So they're in a tough spot, but they fight hard. The Polish experience speaks to that sort of quick trust that commanders can establish once the subordinate has demonstrated some level of skill, right?
Yeah.
If you don't demonstrate it fairly quickly, what choice does the superior have? He's going to start to realize that he probably might have to grip it even tighter. I mean, that's just basic psychology, and it didn't start off well for the Poles, as I said. I think Machich is probably so wary of the German anti-tank guns on the 9th and 10th of August, for example, to go back a little bit, that he sort of balks a bit, and there's some opportunities that are lost, but he makes up for it in some very trying circumstances. On that, I mean, his left flank is completely in the wind, right? And I think overall he was very, very effective. And I think Simonds, at the end of the day, bottom line, this is from James Roberts. Yeah, it would be great to have Henry V. Okay, but this is the key, because the Simonds Monty type is more likely to win the battle. You can't just exclusively characterize command pressure or drive from a superior as some sort of draconian plot to get the subordinate, right? It's not done with a vengeance. Military operations have a tendency to culminate psychologically. Commanders culminate. This is why Dempsey, for example, always said it's better to pick deep objectives, even if you don't reach them. Because once a unit or troops get on an objective, the tendency is to culminate psychologically. Thank God I'm still alive.
That's a fascinating thing about Dempsey, because Dempsey sets these big dramatic inland advances, and then Montgomery gets blamed for him. That's the perfect solution, isn't it? Because that's when I'm on tours in Normandy, and Americans particularly, no offense, my American viewers, start beating Montgomery with a stick about Caen and promising to get to Caen. You go, well, it was Dempsey who promised that as much as it was Montgomery, because of Dempsey's strides in Sicily, where he'd made those 15-mile in a day advance, wherever it was. So it's funny that if you plan something, you allow someone else to get the blame for your own idea. That's kind of the best way to handle it. But I'm conscious of the fact that we're running short of time now. But just David O'Keefe predictably has got another comment there. How much of Simonds' approach may have been impacted by the fact that Cuerrar had tried to get rid of him in January 1944? I know Monty liked him, but that time bomb was always ticking. So do you feel that kind of put a bit more extra pressure on him, or what's your feeling?
Yeah, I think there's pressure on him for sure, but Simonds had demonstrated no reluctance to engage Cuerrar. They have a huge blow up in December 43 in Italy, and I think it proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Simonds is not afraid of Cuerrar. Cuerrar obviously can end him, but Cuerrar would tell Monty, "I want to get rid of Simonds," and Monty would say, "Well, just hold fire on that. Let's think about that for a second. Who are you going to replace him with? Who's the backup to Simonds? You're going to bring Burns up from Italy?" And one of the most problematic parts of the Canadian story in Normandy is the lack of depth on the bench. Okay, there's no one even considered qualified to take over from Keller when he's wounded within the Corps. They have to go all the way down to Italy and bring back Dan Spry. Okay.
Which goes back to your original point about the barrel is not very. There aren't many apples in the barrel to choose from. That the Canada's commitment to providing an entire beachhead in Normandy. There isn't this draw of and us British nicked all your junior officers in the Can Loan program, so you can blame us for creaming off some of your best lower level talent. There's lots of things there, but given that we've got David O'Keefe and the Great Dominion, other Todd Swab, other sort of big World War II TV Canadian history fans, when your 1,000-page book comes out, what are it's a summary to it. What are the key things that you perhaps think are the things people have got wrong about Simonds?
I think they fundamentally get it wrong when they declare or think that he consciously used fear as a motivational technique. That may have been interpreted that way by some, based on individual psychology. But he doesn't consciously go out of his way to instill fear in anybody. I think he's smart enough to know that's probably self-defeating. I think he understood the psychological aspects far better than anyone gives him credit for, and that he constantly tried to address it. Given the demands of all the other things he had to do, think about the fact that he's trying to plan Operation Atlantic, his first Corps operation, and he has to deal with a whole command issue with Keller and the British lack of confidence in Keller, even while Keller's telling Simonds and Cuerrar that he doesn't trust Doug Cunningham, commander of the 9th Canadian Brigade. Well, geez, I haven't even started my first operation yet. Right? Yeah. And I've got all these command issues. And I ultimately, I think people, when they read the book, will realize that a little bit more sympathy has to be given to Simonds for the the depth and breadth of the problems he's facing, operationally, tactically, and psychologically.
Yeah. I think it's from my British point of view. I think he just seems to become a bit of a convenient fall guy for other failings and other inadequacies within the Canadian command structure, and indeed the Anglo-Canadian British Allied command structure. It's interesting, and I think he's definitely worthy of further investigation. And personally, I'm looking forward to your 1,000-page book about this, because he's an interesting figure. I mean, I think he's an innovator. I like some of the stuff he does with the early armored personnel carriers and Totalize and the Kangaroos and the Rams, and of course we haven't touched on the Scheldt Estuary and what happens up there and other part of his career. I think he's definitely worthy of study, and he's definitely I think someone I admire. Yes, I don't really have a dog in the fight about whether on certain things, because Verrières Ridge doesn't mean as much to me as a Brit, because we've got our own issues, Villa Bocage and things to talk about. So we kind of, we talk about that, and Arnhem and Urquhart to Arnhem. So Verrières Ridge perhaps isn't quite in our top 10 of battles we discuss. But fascinating talking to you, John, and I would love to have you back again in the future when we get into grips with Patton again. We've got Kevin Hiemel on tomorrow talking about General Patton. One of the things we're going down, folks, tomorrow is the potential counterfactual of Kevin's written a chapter of his new book about what Patton would have done had he been in charge of Operation Overlord. So I expect the sidebar will go into overdrive with the discussions about that tomorrow. But I would love to come back and discuss Patton with you and a panel, perhaps a Brit, a Canadian, and an American, and maybe a German discussing General Patton. Because if everyone comes into the fight with a preconceived idea of Montgomery and Simonds, they absolutely have a preconceived idea about Patton, and as it is with most of these figures. So anyway, that I think has been a really good presentation, John. I've enjoyed it. I think people here are impressed by it. And David O'Keefe is saying your work on Patton is exceptional. So there we are. So so David does still love you.
I paid Dave to say that, actually.
You paid him, yeah. That's well, we all do. I wonder, these jobs. He's here every day watching the shows, so he's obviously got no life outside of World War II TV. But anyway, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I will just remind people we've got coming up, and I'll come back and say goodbye in a second. So tomorrow we bring Leaders and Leadership Week to a close with Kevin Hiemel talking about General Patton, and then of course it's D-Day. Sunday we've got live streaming some Sword Beach, talking about the South Lancs on in Hermanville and Strong Point Cod. Then we've got Brad St. Croix coming on later on, talking about the 1st Hussars coming ashore supporting the Regina Rifles in Courcelles. And then I may or may not do something later on from Omaha Beach. Then I've got my kind of live stream call-in show in the evening where people can just come in and chat and talk about what D-Day means to them, what Operation Overlord means, what they're thinking about on the 77th anniversary of D-Day. People who wish they were here in Normandy but aren't because of COVID. We can talk all about that on the evening of June the 6th. And then the battlefield live streams start coming in thick and fast. We've got Mark Milner talking about stopping the Panzers on June the 7th. We've got Dead Man's Corner with Niels Henkermans, all about the Stuart tanks coming down the road into Carenton. We've got Manila Patry of Mike Bechtold. We've got Asville. We've got the 2nd Infantry US pushing inland towards over the El River. Loads of things coming up for you. So stay tuned, folks. Please think about becoming a patron to help us do these shows. Please check out us on Twitter and our social media. But right now, it remains me to say thank you very much, Major John Nelson Rickard, for joining us and telling us about Guy Simonds. I have learnt a lot, and we will invite you back again. Did you enjoy it?
I did. Great experience.
Good. So we will have you all again. And thank you very much for watching, folks. And we will see you all again on World War II TV. And thanks again, everybody, for keeping the sidebar going with some amazing chats there. Sometimes it's tempting to just read what you guys are saying, because it's more interesting than what I'm saying. So that sometimes I'll have to have some of you on there, because there's some real expertise coming in there, and you're very polite to each other, which is good. So we all have different opinions, and someone like Guy Simonds naturally helps us kind of coming together by discussing a figure. So anyway, I'm rambling now. Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day.